I'm happy to see you all here today. Lindsay is with me today. Lindsay and I do the learning series together always, and we have a couple of guest speakers today. Tony Mathis is with us. He's one of our MyStar curriculum writers. And Jenny Vandepan is with him also. She's a MyStar Rockstar teacher and PLF. Has been working with us for quite a long time. And Tony and Jenny together wrote this unit along with some input from Steph, who most of you also know, who's one of our other curriculum writers. And Jenny piloted it in her classroom and gave some feedback, and they polished it up, and they're doing great things with this. They presented it at MSTA, and maybe Tony will share some of that good news with you. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead and suggest that we get started. And if people, come in a few minutes late, then no big deal. But we want to honor your time, and I'm thankful that you're here. So, we are going to, in just a second, I'm going to put you in a couple of breakout rooms. Because we are going to do some work with breakout groups today. And so as you get into your breakout room, please just introduce yourself to the people who you're in the room with, because that'll be the people that you're working with today, your name and where you're from, that kind of thing. And then we have a couple of slides after this one with some text boxes that look kind of like sticky notes. And so as you introduce yourselves to each other, if you would just have a little conversation, what do your students struggle with when interpreting graphs and making graphs as a whole? We were just talking about that's a whole nother thing. We might do another lesson on that one, but just when they encounter a graph in some context, what do they struggle with in making sense of that graph? And then if you would just grab a sticky note on those slides and jot something down. So let's see this slide. All right, so I see some problems figuring out what the graph or data means, what goes on what axis. Yeah, looking at the details, the x-axis and the y-axis, pulling together the information from all the parts of the graph, the title, the x and y-axis, et cetera, to make interpretations, making connections to what the graph is showing to the problem or question being asked, right? So how is this helping us construct an explanation or solve a problem? And reading the graph just because they don't have a lot of practice on it. Good. All right. So next slide. Oh, variables. Yes. Figuring out where the variables are, which variable goes where. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about this off-the-shelf lesson on interpreting graphs, the learning performances and the goals. We'll lay that out for you quickly. We're going to do a walkthrough of the lesson plan. And so we're going to do a quick overview of a couple of those 5 phases, and then a couple of the phases we're going to dig in and do some of the activities so that by the end of the session today, you should feel pretty comfortable just like going in and teaching it. It shouldn't be too hard. Shouldn't require too much prep. And then we'll do some reflection and questions at the end, and then we'll let you go. So thanks so much. So with us today, I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but we have Tony, who does curriculum development with us, and Jenny, who is a MyStar teacher and a professional learning facilitator and a rock star, and she's been working with MyStar for a long time, and she actually did this in her classroom, this lesson, and so she has some great real life experience with it. And then Steph is not here today with us, but she also was instrumental in putting together this lesson. And this is one of our off-the-shelf lessons. And so if you're not familiar with the off-the-shelf lesson concept, as MyStar started writing units several years ago, we realized there were times when kids just kind of had holes in their knowledge. And maybe it was something that they should have done in elementary and they didn't quite get to it, or they did it in elementary, but they didn't quite get it. Or every now and then, we'd write a unit and then we'd be like, but there's this one little piece, it doesn't really fit in the unit, but it would be really good for kids to know. And so we started doing some standalone lessons. They're 5E, so there's 5 phases. They take, 3 to 5 to 6 days, classroom days to do. but they're standalone and they have the 5 phases, and they will help you fill in holes. They're also good for the beginning of the school year, right before a break, if you don't want to start a new unit yet, at the end of the school year, those kind of little filler spots too. And so some of them focus on SEPs and CCCs. Some of them focus on some of the DCIs. We have some that are just, identity and skills. So measurement and what does a scientist look like and things like that. If you're a subscriber, which I think all of you are, you have access to all 16 of them. And 7 of them we've made publicly available because we have presented them at NSTA and MSTA, and then part of that deal usually is to make them publicly available. So some of them are available to everybody, including this one, because Tony and Jenny presented it at MSTA last month. All right, and where do you find these? The off-the-shelf lessons, you'll see a pinned box on your dashboard. When you open it up, you can also go to My Lessons, and the off-the-shelf lessons is always one of the choices. And our newest one is there right at the top. So if you're looking for this later on today, that's where you find it. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Tony now.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, so, when we started sort of building this lesson, we decided that we really wanted a lesson that was going to help build students' confidence with approaching new and challenging graphs, wanted to help them scaffold or make a scaffold or some kind of tool that they can use throughout the year. So not just be a one and done, but to have something that will be valuable year long. Practice making their thinking visible, getting their ideas out of their head onto the page. And we also really wanted to make something that was going to be really flexible to you, that you could adapt and tailor to your own circumstances. So kind of a real flyby overview of what the lesson looks like is we have the anchor, where students explain a sort of a joke graph and express their prior knowledge about interpreting graphs there. The uncover, which is all about how do you personally make sense of graphs. The sharing is, sharing out those personal graph sense making routines, and then kind of recording that in a consensus graph interpretation tool, which is what we call the scaffolds that you'll be building. The connect is all about taking those tools that they just made and testing them out, seeing how well they work, revising as needed. And then the check is opportunity for an individual assessment on how well you can deploy the tool that you just made. So like I said, the anchoring experience is a bit of a joke graph. It might be a bit of a lame joke, but we just wanted something that wasn't too scary, but still had a little bit of depth to it to get students thinking and talking about how they make sense of graphs. So just, what do you think this graph is trying to say? And then kind of most importantly, like, how do you know that? What about, what on this graph is leading you to that conclusion? What clues were you using? And as well as this sort of experience, we think it's really important. This is something that we've been adding to more and more lessons as we've been updating our units, is these opportunities to get students to connect to phenomena and problems. So just thinking about, where do you see graphs in your everyday life? What do you think it might be important? Have you ever been confused by a graph? Just trying to get them to connect a little bit deeper to the phenomenon. And, in the lesson plan, I think there's a big list of guiding questions. Don't feel like you need to go through all of them. Pick and choose the ones that are going to resonate with your students. But just try, we just want students to think about how graphs relate to their lives. And after that kind of brief uncover or anchoring activity, we move into the uncover, that, investigation. And this is where we want students to work together to identify, the story of the graph, or to make sense of a graph. And then after they do that, reflect in small groups on sort of how they got there. How did they figure out that story? And the graphs they're looking at are all going to be from this sort of fun horse versus human marathon race that they have over in Wales. So this is the video that we use in the lesson plan to sort of introduce this race. Fingers crossed it's going to play for me. Thumbs up if that's working.
Yeah.
All right, great.
We're in Llynotted Wells, which is in Powys, Wales, and the event is the Whole Earth Man versus Horse race.
I heard how it started with two men who sat in the pub just behind us here, discussing who would be better over a greater distance, man or horse.
Sarah, who is one of our members of our team, signed us up for the competition to take part in Team Whole Earth. The atmosphere is really cool. I'm really excited, a little bit nervous still.
I'm just really looking forward to it. We've been training really hard and I'm really excited to put it all into practice.
We've had quite a lot of help and training for the race from Martin and Liz Yelling, and Liz is running the whole race with us. Poor her, she's got to run the whole thing.
Whole Earth approached my husband and I to coach Team Whole Earth towards this event, and so this is a great opportunity to get involved and make sure that they're physically and mentally prepared for the event so they can go into it relaxed and happy and confident that they can do it.
We've got tarmac roads up hills, very steep, and we've got rocky roads uphill, we've got grassy slope, nothing on the flat.
The end was exhilarating, to be fair, that water crossing.
I was very surprised at how equal man and horse is over this sort of terrain.
In theory, the horse should always win. Theory is nothing.
It was really nice not only being able to share the experience between the three of us, but having his supporters all the way through as well.
Definitely.
I don't think I'd have had as much momentum on my way round if I hadn't had someone there encouraging me on the way, which is really nice.
A sharp stick.
Yeah, and the great thing about this race is that it's just kind of fun, a little silly. We're not trying to couple this sort of skills-based lesson with content knowledge as well. And then all their results were publicly available too, so we could make a bunch of fun graphs with them. So we made 4 different graphs of these results, with the intention that you can really choose the graph that you think is going to work best in your classroom. Some of them are very, very simple. Some of them are a bit more complicated. And they're all made with different conventions that you might see in the science class. Like I know on one of them, the x-axis is formatted like it's like something you'd see in geology, going back in time. Which would be a little unusual for race results, but when you get into some of our units are geology, earth history, you're going to be looking at graphs like that. So sort of the trade-off is some of these representations might not technically be the best way to represent this particular data, but they're all reasonable representations of it. And pick the one that you think is going to work best for your students. And the focus of this whole part is really on how you make sense of the graph, not so much the answers. And so for this next part, we want students to annotate these graphs, which is a process of recording and sharing what happens in your mind as you make sense of a text. And this is coming from Heather Howlett at WestEd. They run the reading apprenticeship program. We've worked with them on a couple of units to integrate some of their strategies. And she did a learning series, I think last year. But it's great. And if you're unfamiliar with text annotations, there is this video that's an excerpt of that learning series. I think it's like 7 minutes long. It's great. It's in the lesson plan. And if you get a chance, I'd really recommend that you watch it. Just to make sure we get everyone out of here on time. I don't think we're going to watch it today. But if you do have a couple of minutes, I definitely recommend it. She does a great job. And so, you know, when we're looking at these graphs, we want students to start just writing down the things that are coming into their mind as they're looking at these graphs, right? So, like when you're looking at that y-axis, one of the big revelations is sort of that, oh, when you run faster, you're going to have a smaller time, right? So it's the lower you are in the graph, the better. Like that's something that, you know, you want to see. And to help students get going with this, we do give them some kind of guiding questions or prompts to help them with these annotations and kind of spark their thinking. And when you're working with students, you know, you're going to see things like horses are fast, humans mostly take longer. There is this pattern that, you know, recently humans started winning a bit more often. And you can build on some of these ideas too, like why is that? Oh, maybe, you know, maybe it's GMO foods or something, right? And as a teacher, you can kind of facilitate this and really highlight the annotations that you think are going to be really important for students to build on, and start to parking lot some of the ones like, you know, maybe the GMO here that is a little bit less relevant. So let's, and then once you kind of get to the end of this annotation process, students use this to develop a claim with evidence. So we give them a sentence frame and they say, you know, based on this graph, blank are better marathon runners because. And so we do want them to use this graph to support their claims. So this was a little peek at one of the graphs, which the line graph. Let's now break out into breakout rooms and take a little bit closer look at 3 of the other graphs that are available with this data set. So on the next 3 slides, there should be one for each breakout room. And Chris, if you maybe want to break everyone up. And I don't know,
Yeah.
am I missing anything here?
Yeah, so you're going to find the slide that has your room number. It'll say team 1, team 2, team 3. That's your room 1, room 2, and room 3. And it'll give you a chance to look at, you know, Tony said there are 4 graphs to choose from that you can use with your kids. And so there's this line graph and then 3 more. So we'll give each room 1 more. And you'll see on the slide that there are some little blank cloud shapes. And so if you want to type your thoughts in those and then drag them and place them on the graph, where you might do it to annotate, you know, in the classroom, kids are going to do this on paper, but we're trying to do it virtually here. So we're doing it on the slide. So talk to your group, think about, you know, what are you thinking about metacognitively as you look at that graph, and then grab some of those little clouds and do some annotations. And you can always make copies if you need more clouds, you know, just copy paste and make some more empty ones. We'll give you a few minutes to just give that a try. And then we'll call you back. All right.
All right. So I'm going to talk you through some of the annotations for each type of the graph. And our first team 1 graph here is a simple bar graph. Number of wins for humans versus horse. So here it is very simple, and it's so funny. I struggled with this in my class because they didn't have a whole lot to work with, they felt like. So they're basically like horses won all the time. Nothing else to talk about. So that is an opportunity to come up with a lot of predictions or questions. However, in the middle school level, like once they think the job is done, they don't want to go and do some extra steps. That's why I do see a lot of these are questions. Is the course always the same? Is this multiple years or just last year? How many humans versus horses in the race? You know, was it even number or was it uneven? So all sorts of good questions, but really that's all they have. So if you are focused on wanting students to build the skill of predicting or asking questions when they encounter a graph, this would be a great choice. But yes, I see at the very end, they were typing this graph is very simplistic. Questions and predictions are definitely the focus of using this graph. We'll go on to team 2. All right, this one here has a lot more to work with. It has the years listed out. And this one, like Tony said, it starts out with the 2023 year at like the origin of the graph and then works backwards. So why back in time? That was the number one thing I had some students not get past, which was interesting, you know, because they notice, hey, this is weird. So here, this is the time difference. Above the line is the amount of time the race, whether they took, the difference between horses and humans time. So above the line, this is something that was a little more complicated. And I see that my students in general were just looking at this as horses winning. They completely jumped over the fact that we're talking about like they won by a lot. So negative time I see up here was a question, very good. Horses one placement versus human one placement. That I guess is referring to the fact that one is on one side, one is on the other. But that's one that didn't even come up that you guys pointed out. That is wonderful. The timeline was tough too. So looking at this again, I like this graph because it forces the students to figure out what in the world is going on in this graph that I have, I'm not familiar with, right? That's the whole goal. And this is an intriguing graph. So we're talking about how how far or how little a horse or human won versus did they win or not. So that takes, this graph in particular is great because it forces them to really slow down and look and figure out what is this graph all about. So it takes focus. So if you want students to slow down and focus on the graph to figure it out, this is the graph for that. This one was a nice graph. This is a good middle of the road graph. Horse versus human winning times. So this one is just straight up. Here are the years and here is the time that each horse or human winner had for that. This one has a title and a key, which is nice. Not all of them have keys. And it also, though, has data as far as the time that the winner at that point in time, it took them to run the race. So you have the light and dark, who won, and then the time aspect. I think this is a cool graph. This one is the one in addition to the first one that Tony talked about. Those two were my winning graphs as far as what I felt was appropriate for my students. Not having an idea of how, like a specific skill I wanted them to focus on. So I like the comment, this graph makes it easier to see that horses win the race more often. And again, questioning the time on the bottom is good for students to point out as well. The graph shows winning times get slower. Very interesting. And that's an aspect that was harder to pull out of other graphs. Also, this one in particular, this one has a lot of data. So a lot of patterns to point out, a lot of identifying pieces of evidence that are important. This does not drive questions or predictions as much. So if you want a good starting point for your students, I felt that the first graph and then this team 3 graph were good for those as well. So some takeaways from my experience. I piloted all 4 graphs in different hours. And I started out actually just giving these to 4 groups with 4 students. And they looked at me with wide eyes and had no idea where to start. So I found it valuable to do a whole class activity. The students were shouting out responses, and I was writing them down under a document camera. They each had their own copy that they also wrote along on. One thing I found valuable once students started making comments is I liked to number them. So you can see on this slide here, 1, 2, I had a few others on there. That's the order the conversation went, and it bounced around. And that's why I thought it was really neat, where a noticing of an important piece of information could lead to questions and predictions. So this was that last graph, team 3's graph, and I liked how that was evident. So even if they didn't ask questions or make predictions, a comment about an important piece of information a student found did lead to that in like a popcorn kind of conversation. So that is a bonus of having it done in a whole class. And then it gives me as a teacher insight on how the conversation went by numbering, just to track student thinking and how it evolved throughout the conversation. This one also challenged assumptions of reading a graph. Automatically, my students thought the taller bars win. They're the best. Because when we look at bar graphs, we were talking about in elementary, how many kids like chocolate ice cream? The tallest bar was the winner. And immediately my students thought that until a student said, wait, tall bars mean it takes a long time. For a race, we don't want to take a long time. And then that made the student slow down. Now I know if that one student didn't mention that, 95% of my students would have the same misconception. But because we did it whole class and the students got to think of it once they heard another student point that out, that changed the entire value of this activity, or the how they view the graph actually. So I like how it can handle misconceptions, as well as maybe students didn't even notice the numbers on the bottom. They just assume it starts at a earlier time and goes to a more recent time. So those automatic habits students have developed are challenged when they have to stop and look at these graphs. So doing that whole group, I found the value in that for those reasons.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And so once students kind of develop or figure out what the story of the graph is, we want them to think a little bit about, well, how did you get there, right? How do you make sense of graphs? Like, what process did you use? And we included some guiding questions in the student handout, like, what parts of the graphs helped you figure out the story of the graph? Name a challenge. How did you overcome it? And then I think probably most importantly, if you were to look at a new graph, what do you think should be the first thing you check? What does that tell you? And what we want students to do is use these answers, and especially the answer for this third guiding question, to build their own sort of scaffold or tool that they can use to interpret graphs. And this will just be a draft tool. They'll have a chance to revise it, but just a starting place for the process that they think they should be using to make sense of graphs. So just like the students, we'll have you again go into those same breakout rooms and reflect on how you made sense of those those graphs that you looked at, or really any graphs, and what process do you use to make sense of graphs? And look for you to record that again. Again, each team has the same slide, so team 1, team 2, team 3, and just jot down your ideas for the process that you think we should be using to make sense of graphs on these slides.
All right, I'm going to open the rooms, and we're going to just take a few minutes to do this, so they don't have to be perfect, but work with your team and see if you can come up with 2 or 3 steps. All right.
Jenny, I loved your stories of your kids teaching other kids, right? Like that's going to be so much more impactful.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's just a couple of kids that will notice it, but because they're the minority, voice, sometimes their voice doesn't get heard. So in the class, when one kid speaks out, then like other people validating that, I think is powerful too to the students.
Tony.
All right, thank you, Chris. Yeah, and thank you, everyone. It looks like everyone really dove in to that activity, so really appreciate that. And moving forward, it takes us into the share your ideas, where we really want students to kind of having that consensus, facilitated consensus discussion, right? Sharing their process with their peers. And additionally, and really importantly, we provide videos of experts going through this annotation process for each of the 4 graphs as well. So students can compare their process to the video that expert used. And then what we want them to do is use the evidence from their peers and an expert to revise that process. Oops, that was a misclick. Okay, sorry about that. Let me. So, like I mentioned, it was really important to us because expert and novices approach graphs so differently. We really didn't want this lesson to just be the blind leading the blind with a bunch of 6th graders trying to teach each other how to interpret graphs. So every graph in this lesson has an expert video that goes with it that you can use if you want to. Really recommend using the ones in the share. Those are must-haves in my opinion, but every video in every graph in the lesson has a video that goes with it. So let's take a minute and...
Hi, my name is Lindsay Watch, and I'm an environmental engineer and science educator. And today I'm going to be looking at a graph to help answer the question, are horses or humans faster marathoners? So the first thing I do when I look at a graph is I look for a title. That usually cues me into a lot of the information I'm going to be reviewing. So here we see the title is Winning Times for Humans and Horses, okay? So the next thing I do when I'm looking at a graph is I look at the X and Y axes. So we'll start with the X axis. So I see here down at the bottom, we've got year as a label, okay? So on the far left of the X axis, we see it starts at 1980 and the far right goes to 2020. But something I do notice is there's a couple points beyond that 2020. So maybe this is data that goes out to 2022 because I see 1, 2 more dots beyond that. Okay. So then I can look at the Y-axis. And so here I see time and it gives us a format and there's hours, minutes, seconds. All right. So at the bottom of the Y-axis, I see we have 100. That tells me that's 1 hour is the race time. And then we move up and it's 1.5 hours. Okay, so these go by 30-minute increments all the way up to 3 hours. Okay, so between 1 and 3 hours are the race times that we're seeing between 1980 and maybe about 2022. So I might suggest the title could add a little more information. Maybe something like winning times for humans and horses over time, over a 40-year span, between 1980 and 2020. You know, if you can add more of that information, that can often be helpful for viewers looking at a graph. So the next thing I would look at with a graph would be the legend. What are these dots telling me? And so here I see the legend, and we've got fastest horse time with a black dot, and then fastest human time with gray dots. Okay, so now I can look at the graph and I see those black dots and those gray dots. Oh, and they're connected by lines. Each of those dots is connected by a black line for the horse times and a gray line for the human times. All right, got it. And then what I can do is, now that I've familiarized myself with the information on the axes and what the data points represent, I can kind of zoom out on this graph and look for any trends, patterns, you know, peaks or valleys, or, you know, interesting points that might call my attention to help answer my question. So something I might think is that the horse times have been increasing over the time in this graph, whereas human times may be a little increased, but not nearly as much. And you can also see that if you compare the black and the gray dot distances between these two lines. And so you can see there's a big difference in general. You know, here we've got a few outliers, but in general, there's a bigger gap between the gray and the black dots until maybe after the year 2000. Now you see there's a lot of overlap here between 2000 and 2010. Maybe the gap gets a little bigger again, but now it's closed again, and they're very similar at the end of the time scale here. So I would really be curious to see how the next 10 years or so those times pan out, because are we seeing some sort of reversal in you know, who's faster? From this data, I would say that in general, horses are faster than humans, but what's going to happen here in the next 10 or 20 years? Is that going to be different? That would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, so there's an example video. All the videos are right about that length, right around 3-4 minutes, nothing too long.
Hi.
And you know, like I said, we want students to be incorporating pieces from both their peers as well as the experts process and doing a revision of their graphing tools. So we make, so there's a new space on all the student handouts for students to incorporate this additional information. And, you know, we call it a final revision, but, you know, students can really be adapting this and tweaking it as they go along. So yeah, if at this point of the lesson, it could very well be something like, you know, read the title, describe the x-axis, describe the y-axis, match the key to the data, identify patterns. Really just something to help students get going here. All right, and now, so during this share, I think it's important to point out that at least as far as the lesson plan is concerned and the powers that be at MyStar, there's no one answer or format for how we think these tools should look like. And there's lots of room for you to put your thumb on the scale and kind of herd students towards a process that has worked well for you in the past, or that you want to use in your building or district. So, you know, even though this is maybe a bit more of a student-centered approach, there's lots of room here for you to guide students where you want them to go. The lesson plan provides multiple exemplars for what these could look like. In my own personal opinion, I think it's really good when these tools have concrete steps that make sense to students, so that, you know, when you pull this out in a day, week, month's time, students can kind of jump in and use it effectively. I think using action verbs that encourage sense making is really good too. So rather than things like check the y-axis, maybe moving towards something to like describe the y-axis, just to help them dig down a little bit more. And then, you know, I think it's good too if we can help students connect the graph to sort of the question or the phenomenon. So, you know, compare the title to the question. What do you think is going to be important about this graph? Things like that. And while these don't have to be personalized, you know, you could definitely make one of these for your class and, you know, put it up on the wall. I think if you can be personalized or let students, you know, keep their own versions, that's great. But really, there's a lot of flexibility here for you to make this your own. And Jenny, I might throw it back over to you to talk a little bit about how this process worked during the pilot.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Even looking back to the final revision here, I did have to advise my students to add at least one step. You know, middle schoolers, when you say, now add a step where you think you need to, they're like, I'm good, I'm not adding anything. So I did ask them to add at least one more step. A lot of them ended up saying like to look at the Y and X axis, and that was like one step together. So several of them then separated them into two steps, which is wonderful. And then after all of this has been done, I wanted to make sure that this first step was to read the title for my students. I did as my teacher, and I wanted to personalize that because a lot of my students, I noticed, wanted to go right to the x-axis, and they saw the numbers and they read the title or the label, but they weren't quite sure, like, what is this even about? Slow down. And I had to ask them to slow down a lot. The title, and that was my sticking point as a teacher. So they revised it on their own, and then I had them work with groups on the next activities. So they made their own personal mental tool, I called it. And then the next activity they did, they worked in groups. So they actually forced them to share what their own interpretation tool was with their groups. And this is an excellent opportunity just to have them do that as well. In like their group of 4 students or however you organize groups. So here you have one revision from peers, and the one revision from the expert is where you would get that feedback from the expert and the peers.
It's Jenny. So at the end of this process, you know, you should have a revised, pretty usable a scaffold that students can use to help make sense of graphs. And this next lesson phase is all about getting students to test out those scaffolds, right? Use those tools, see how they work, make any revisions that are needed. Kind of in the theme of giving lots of options and something flexible. There's 3 different phenomena that you can choose from in the Connect. You could pick the one that you think will work best for your class. You could let groups pick the one that speaks to them. You could assign different groups to different phenomena. There's lots of flexibility here. And as well, if students need a little bit more practice using this, there's expert videos as well for all of these graphs that they can use to revise their tools if you get to the end and it seems like they need a little bit more work on their scaffold. So Chris, are we barreling through? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I think we can give everybody about 5 or 6 minutes in a group to kind of take a look at one, and they may not totally finish, and we'll call them back because we don't want to run over. But we did want to give you one more chance to take a look with your group at a graph and do the annotation, and then listen to the expert video, and then revise your tool if needed. So each group made a tool a few minutes ago. And so if you want to use that tool with your scenario to annotate your graph, and if you have time to watch the expert graph and revise it, that'll be great. But we'll give you about 5 minutes to just kind of dig into one of those scenarios so that you're familiar with them. So you'll find there's multiple slides for each team this time. So you have a slide with the scenario, you have a slide with the graph, with the little bubbles for the annotation. You have a slide that has your expert video, and then
Hi, everyone.
you have the slide that you already did earlier in the deck that has your tool. So use those to see if you can do some annotations and see if your tool works, and then we'll call you back in about 5 minutes.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. Sorry for pulling you out of those breakout rooms before you're done, but we want to make sure we get through everything and get everyone out of here by 5. So like I mentioned, there's 3 different scenarios that you can choose from for the Connect. In case you didn't get a chance to see, the first one here is about lake temperatures and layers of different temperature water that forms in lakes. This graph is probably the most unusual graph in possibly all of MyStar, but it's very commonly used by limnologists and oceanographers. It's kind of backwards than what you'd usually see in middle school. But really throughout this lesson, we're hoping to expose students to a bunch of different looking graphs and help them see that no matter what the graph looks like, there's some common strategies that you can use to try to make sense of it and really set them up for success when they're looking at the graphs that they'll see throughout MyStar. And the second scenario is a little bit more mathy. So it's about the birthday paradox and sort of this unusual mathematical phenomenon of when you have, I think it's more than 26 or 30 people together in a room, there's a 50% chance that someone in that room shares a birthday. And this is a pretty familiar bar graph, but the skill that students need to do here is kind of interpolate between the points of the graph, and recognize that even though they're interested in a group of 32 or 35 and that's not on the graph, they can still use this graph as evidence. And then the last graph is another sort of pretty unusual graph for middle school. I think there might be 1 or 2 of these types of graphs in MyStar, but it's just about blood typing and what are the most common blood types found around the world. And it uses a stacked bar graph, which are basically just pie charts next to each other, but rectangles instead of circles. And yeah, again, just trying to expose students to some different, possibly scary looking graphs, get them past that moment of like, oh, like, what is this? I don't know what to do. And just like lean on the process and start digging into some of these graphs. So from there, I'm really curious about your sort of noticings and wonderings, about this activity. Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. Would love to hear what you have to say.
So I was kind of thinking that with 8th graders, maybe even in the beginning, giving them all of the graphs and having them, just like we analyzed, put them into small groups and do that analysis process. So what we did here tonight, starting it that way, but I go back and forth depending on their knowledge. So if it was a group that maybe that isn't very strong, then probably I would do more of a scaffolding.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. You know, there's lots of flexibility here, and I think especially if students have comfort like doing those annotations, if that's something that they're practiced with, then yeah, like throw them in the deep end.
So I liked that you guys have provided multiple options, and I could envision, you know, maybe working just with one group, but I could go back and revisit it with graphs that we didn't use in that initial lesson. So I think there's some great resources to just kind of quick come back and, you know, make sure that we remember we're all on the same page. So I like that there's multiple graphs that I would have access to.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great idea to use these as reteaches. All right. Well, if anyone else has anything else they want to share, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll come back to it in a minute or two. But just taking a peek at this last graph that's a little bit more of a individual assessment. And this graph is probably, like, in terms of graph interpretation, the most difficult in the lesson. But I think what we really want to be assessing here is how well are students applying the scaffold that they made. You know, are students approaching this scary graph with confidence? Are they making their thinking visible? More so than are they getting the exact right answer on the worksheet? So this graph, the scenario here is, you know, Pia hit her growth spurt. She outgrew all of her clothes, started thinking about her twin brother, like how is he gonna grow? And then how do, you know, males and females grow differently? So this is a CDC growth chart, and they're comparing male and female growth on it. And, you know, to do this, students have to identify, you know, the age where the slopes of these lines change. And that's a difficult task. But one of the things that I might be stealing some of your thunder here, Jenny, but you know, looking at some of the pieces of student work from Jenny's classroom just really got me excited, because you could really see students making their thinking visible, and you could see where students were kind of on the right track and then where they started to get over their skis in terms of their math ability a little bit. So, you know, questions like, well, why do females get low at the top? Like, oh, you're so close, right? You're right there. Like, how does growth on this graph work? Thinking about those slopes and connecting with, like, what does that slope really mean? That was something that was really exciting to me. So this was a student who, you know, maybe didn't get the answer, quote unquote, right, but they're really making their thinking visible. They're applying the tools that they made really well. They're engaging in this practice in a way that will really help you sort of support them and kind of go from there. So that's what really got me excited about this lesson and kind of where we ended up. So that's kind of the brief flyby of the lesson. And then these last couple minutes, I think we'd love for you to share, you know, a reflection or a takeaway
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks. When I saw this lesson, I was pretty excited about it too. So, we will hang out and answer questions if you have questions. I don't want to do a whole bunch of questions right now because again, 3 minutes and I want to get you out of here. But if you have questions and you want to hang out, right after 5 o'clock, we'll be happy to talk to you about that. We do have a couple of things coming up for the rest of the year. Not too much. We're kind of slowing down for the end of the year, but we have a phase 2 session, 2 hours of 3-dimensional assessment. So if you haven't thought deeply about what to do with those 3-dimensional pre-post tests and embedded assessments, or how to grade them, or how to make them easier for your students or easier for you, Barb will be with us and she has some great advice there. And then our last learning series on May 14th, we're going to talk about all the things that we've added to the revised units and why you might really like them, and maybe convince you to switch from the archived, the old version to the new version. So that's on the 14th. Sketches are available. I will send out an email tomorrow morning for this course specifically with information about the sketches. Thanks so much for your time and thanks for being here. Join our Facebook group if you would like. We'd be happy to have you. Barb posts something just about every day. And we do have some conversation going around there. Again, thanks for your time. Thanks for being here.